The basement was never meant to be part of the tour when I first looked at the house. It was more of a feature mentioned in passing. The realtor eager to emphasize the spacious kitchen, the wraparound porch, and the fact that it was one of the safest streets in town. I was the one who insisted on seeing it, curious about the home's history and every nook it might hide. The realtor hesitated, probably because basements don't sell homes. When we finally went down, it was precisely what you'd expect. Dimly lit, walls covered in rough, unfinished concrete, a few shelves, and the hum of an ancient furnace that seemed to linger longer than it should. I couldn't shake the smell, though. There was a faint, sour scent that wafted up even through the usual damp earth basement smell. Something sharp and unnatural. But once I moved in, the basement became nothing more than a place to store boxes. I rarely went down there, honestly. Life had settled into a routine, and the basement was at the far edge of my consciousness, until a leak started dripping from one corner of the ceiling, pooling on the floor in a slow, steady rhythm that echoed in the silence. Annoyed, I cleared a few boxes and shelves to find the source, only to notice something unusual about one of the walls. Beneath a layer of dust, I spotted a slight irregularity in the concrete, a seam that wasn't quite flush. The closer I looked, the more certain I became that the wall didn't match the rest of the basement's construction. A new kind of curiosity sparked, and for the first time I really studied that side of the basement. I couldn't find any obvious handles or hinges, but there was a slight gap along one edge, just enough for my fingers to catch. After some effort, the section of the wall shifted, a groan of dust escaping into the air. What it revealed wasn't exactly a door. It was more like a narrow crawl space, one leading into a void of darkness. I hesitated. Something about it made my stomach clench, like a primal warning that kept me frozen in place. But against every instinct, I felt drawn to it. I fumbled for my phone and switched on the flashlight, casting a weak glow into the opening. The space beyond was tight, not built for someone of my size to enter easily. The smell was overpowering now, that same sour tang that I'd noticed before. My light flickered over something that looked like rotting wood, perhaps a remnant of an old, makeshift barricade, and it became clear that no one had been here for a long time. I took a step closer, the light landing on something strange at the far end of the crawl space. A small, heavy box, pushed up against the wall, as if someone had abandoned it in haste. Every part of me wanted to close the wall and walk back upstairs, pretend I hadn't seen a thing. But something about the box, sitting alone in that forgotten space, held me captive. I crouched down, stretching my arm as far as it would go until my fingers brushed against its cold, metallic surface. The box felt heavier than it looked, and when I pulled it out and dusted it off, I saw that it was locked, an old-fashioned combination lock securing the lid. I'd always thought myself practical, never one for superstitions. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was in this box wasn't meant to be found. I placed it on the basement floor, letting my flashlight hover over it, studying the lock, tracing its rusted metal edges. Numbers were faintly etched into the metal, almost worn away. I couldn't make out a full sequence, only a 3 and a 7 barely discernible. In the silence, I heard a soft click, like a door easing open. But when I looked around, nothing had changed. The basement remained still, the boxes and shelves unmoving in the flashlight's glow. But I knew something had shifted, a sense of intrusion settling in. In that moment, the basement no longer felt like my own. It felt older, holding a secret that was meant to stay buried. That night, I couldn't shake the thought of the box. It sat in my basement, just out of reach but looming large in my mind. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it. The heavy metal, the faint numbers etched onto the lock, the rust creeping over its surface like a disease. I slept fitfully, jolted awake by vague dreams of things hidden and forgotten, of shadows slipping behind walls. By morning, I was too curious to resist. I grabbed a notebook and pen, something I hadn't done since college, and sketched out the faint numbers I'd seen on the lock. A 3 and a 7. I spent an hour trying to figure out what the remaining 2 numbers might be. Part of me laughed at my own stubbornness. How ridiculous was it to waste time on an old, locked box found in a musty crawl space? But as the hours stretched on, the box seemed to worm its way deeper into my thoughts. Couldn't let it go. After pacing back and forth, I finally went down to the basement. In the dim light, the crawl space felt different, almost as if it were watching me, and I had to suppress a shiver. I knelt by the box again, feeling the chill of the metal seep into my hands. Taking a deep breath, I began turning the combination lock, 1 digit at a time, running through every possible sequence that included 3 and 7. As I turned the lock, I felt almost silly, like some amateur sleuth. But there was something more than curiosity behind my actions. A pull, something more unsettling than simple intrigue. I must have tried a dozen different combinations when, finally, there was a subtle shift in the lock. I turned it one last time and it clicked open. The lid creaked as I lifted it, and the smell hit me first, stale, metallic, with an undertone of decay that made me instinctively recoil. Inside, bundled in layers of brittle, discolored cloth, were small objects that seemed to have been hidden away in deliberate haste. I felt a strange unease as I began unwrapping each item, one by one, like disturbing some long-forgotten grave. The first thing I pulled out was an old, tarnished locket, its chain broken and twisted. I flipped it open, expecting a photo or engraving, but the inside was empty, as if it had once held something precious that had since disappeared. My hands moved to the next item, which was something I didn't immediately recognize. A small, leather-bound book, worn and cracked along its spine. There were no markings on the cover or any title, just plain, faded leather that crumbled slightly as I touched it. When I opened it, the pages were filled with handwriting, dense and messy, nearly illegible. The ink had faded, and in places, the words bled into each other, but I could make out fragments of phrases. Must not tell. Keep hidden. The dark will. I shut the book abruptly, a creeping unease prickling the back of my neck. The basement, once just a place to store boxes, felt as if it were closing in, as though the air had thickened, turning stale and oppressive. I glanced back at the crawl space, half expecting something to move in the shadows, but it was still silent. The last object in the box was a small bundle wrapped tightly in cloth. I hesitated before unwrapping it, a voice in my mind telling me to leave it alone, to put everything back and seal up the crawl space for good. But I'd come this far, and whatever was in the bundle felt like the answer to questions I hadn't dared to ask. Inside the cloth was a single key, old and worn, with a long, narrow shaft and an intricate handle. It felt heavy in my hand, as though it were made of something denser than simple metal. There was no marking to indicate what it might unlock, but the design was unmistakable. An old-fashioned skeleton key, the kind that hadn't been in use for decades. I had no idea what it belonged to, yet I could feel its importance, a strange, almost reverent weight. The thought struck me like a lightning bolt. Somewhere, this key still had a purpose, a lock waiting for it. The silence in the basement felt different now, heavy and listening. I gathered the items, carefully tucking them back into the box, unable to shake the feeling that I'd disturbed something that had been at rest for a very long time. I stood up, the key cold in my hand, and I glanced at the walls of the basement, half expecting to find some hidden door or passage I'd missed. But there was nothing but bare, unfinished concrete, solid and impenetrable. Yet, as I headed back upstairs, my footsteps echoing off the walls, I felt like I wasn't alone. Something had changed. It was as if the house itself was watching, aware of the secrets I'd unearthed, the lock I'd opened, and I knew with a strange, inevitable certainty that the key in my hand would lead me somewhere I wasn't meant to go. Over the next few days, the key consumed me. I found myself thinking about it constantly, absent-mindedly tracing its shape in my pocket, wondering what it might unlock. The logical part of me kept insisting it was just a key from an old door, maybe even something left by a previous homeowner. But deep down, I knew it was something more. I could feel it, a strange weight pressing against my mind, urging me to find where it belonged. I started small, testing the key on every lock in the house. I tried every door, every closet, and even the basement crawl space again, but nothing fit. It was as if the house itself was taunting me, each failed attempt feeding my curiosity, making it burn hotter. Frustrated, I began researching the property, digging into its history to see if anything could offer a clue. The house was old, older than the official records at the local library suggested. Built sometime in the early 1900s, it had changed hands multiple times, each owner staying for only a few years. There were no specific complaints or issues noted in the documents, just an odd history of brief ownership. No one seemed to stick around for long. One name, however, kept appearing in old papers, a man named Edgar Collins who owned the house during the 1920s. His name seemed to be linked to several other properties in town, though any mention of him was sparse and vague. I went back to the notebook, scribbling down each detail I could find, trying to piece together a picture of who he was and what he might have hidden in my basement. My mind kept returning to the leather-bound book from the box. The phrases I could make out hinted at secrecy, something kept hidden. But the handwriting was hard to decipher, and I was only able to read scattered words before the ink became too faded or smudged. The following evening, as I sat surrounded by old property records and half-finished notes, I heard a noise downstairs. It was faint, a soft scrape like something shifting against the floor. I froze, every muscle tense. The sound was coming from the basement. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to let whatever it was settle back into silence. But the key felt heavier in my pocket, and the curiosity that had burned so brightly the past few days now pushed me forward, drawing me towards the basement stairs. I took each step slowly, my heart pounding against my ribs, the wooden stairs creaking beneath me. As I reached the bottom, the faint scent of decay returned, stronger now, almost pungent. I flicked on the basement light, half expecting to see something waiting in the shadows. But everything appeared exactly as I'd left it. The crawl space undisturbed, the boxes stacked neatly along the walls. I exhaled, feeling a mixture of relief and disappointment. The noise must have been my imagination, I thought, another trick of a mind fixated on mysteries that didn't exist. I was about to head back upstairs when I noticed something new on the basement floor, just near the crawl space. It was barely visible, just a faint outline in the dust. A footprint, smaller than my own, pressed lightly into the dirt. I knelt down, examining it, my mind racing with explanations. Perhaps it was old, left by a previous homeowner. But as I looked closer, I realized the footprint was fresh, as though someone had been standing there only moments before. A chill ran down my spine. I looked around, half expecting to see someone hiding in the shadows, but I was alone. Unease settled over me, heavy and oppressive. As I stood and took a step back, something was wrong. It felt as if the basement had become a place beyond my control, something foreign and strange, like the walls themselves held secrets they weren't willing to reveal. Without thinking, I reached into my pocket and pulled out the key. I stared at it, my fingers trembling, and I felt the same pull that had gripped me since I'd first found it. Somehow, I knew the key had brought me here for a reason. But as I held it in my hand, the basement seemed darker, the shadows denser, pressing in around me. The air felt thick, as if the walls were closing in, and for the first time I felt a twinge of fear. Then, as if in answer, I heard the noise again. A soft, almost imperceptible creak from somewhere deep within the house, like a door easing open. This time, I knew it wasn't my imagination. There was something here, something that had been waiting, and the key in my hand was my only guide to finding it. I backed away slowly, clutching the key, my heart racing as I reached the stairs. Whatever I'd unlocked, whatever I'd disturbed, it was still here, and I was no longer certain that I wanted to find out what it was. The next morning, I felt as if I hadn't slept at all. Every sound in the house had kept me on edge, from the creaks of the floorboards to the faint hum of the old pipes. I kept telling myself it was just the age of the place, but that didn't explain the footprint in the basement, or the way the air seemed to press against me, like a warning I couldn't shake. I decided to do a more thorough search of the house. Something in the back of my mind told me that if I found the lock that matched the key, I might finally understand what I'd uncovered. So I started with the rooms on the main floor, meticulously checking every closet, every door frame, even the walls, hoping to find some hidden panel or forgotten door. But every lock was modern, every door familiar and empty of secrets. By late afternoon, I had almost given up. The idea that the key didn't belong to anything here, that maybe it was simply an artifact with no purpose, started to seem more likely. But as I passed the hallway closet on the second floor, a strange thought occurred to me. I'd never really looked inside, beyond tossing in a few spare blankets. It was an odd-shaped closet, narrow and deeper than it looked from the outside, a relic of the house's unusual architecture. I opened the closet door, half expecting it to be empty, but something about the space seemed different. I stepped inside, feeling along the walls, knocking gently on the wood. And then my fingers brushed something odd, a faint outline near the back, where the wall didn't quite line up. I pressed against it, and to my surprise, the panel shifted. My heart pounded as the panel slid aside, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. It looked older than the rest of the house, the wooden steps worn and uneven, as if countless feet had traveled this path long before I had ever set foot here. The air that drifted up was stale, thick with dust and that faint sour smell that I'd first noticed in the basement. I hesitated, gripping the key tightly, the weight of it grounding me. My mind screamed at me to shut the panel and walk away, but I felt the pull again, urging me forward. I took a deep breath and stepped onto the first stair, my flashlight illuminating a narrow corridor stretching down, carved into the very foundation of the house. Each step echoed in the tight space, and with each one, the air grew colder, the walls closing in as I descended further into the unknown. I counted the steps, 12, 15, 20, until finally, I reached the bottom. The passageway opened up slightly, revealing a heavy wooden door set into the stone wall, its dark surface warped with age. My hands shook as I held the key up to the lock, barely daring to believe it would fit. But as soon as the metal met the keyhole, it slid in smoothly, almost as if it had been waiting for this moment. I took a deep breath and turned the key, hearing the lock's internal mechanisms shift with a low, ancient groan. The door swung open. Inside was a small, dimly lit room, barely large enough to move around in. The walls were lined with shelves, each one filled with old jars and strange artifacts, things I couldn't quite recognize. In the center of the room was a small wooden table, its surface covered in dust. Atop it lay a single piece of paper, brittle and yellowed with age, weighted down by an old, heavy book. I stepped forward, the floor creaking under my weight, and picked up the paper. The handwriting was the same as the book I'd found in the box. Messy, almost frantic, as if whoever had written it was in a hurry or under duress. The words were cryptic, disjointed. "Keep it hidden. They must not find it. I was wrong." I barely breathed as I read, each phrase filling me with a deeper sense of dread. The notes mentioned something about the Watchers, beings that were bound to the walls and always listening. My skin crawled, and I felt the urge to drop the paper and run. But there was something more, something that hinted at why this place had been built. The final lines on the paper read, "The key is the seal. If it is removed, the door will open and they will know." As I held the paper, the room seemed to grow colder, a chill that settled into my bones. I realized, with a dawning horror, that I had disturbed something that had been deliberately hidden, locked away for a reason. The mention of the key as a seal gnawed at me. Had opening the lock unleashed something I couldn't see, something that now lingered in the walls of my house? I backed out of the room slowly, keeping my eyes on the shadows, the sense of unseen eyes crawling over my skin. I turned and made my way up the staircase as quickly as I could, every step feeling heavier, the silence pressing in around me. When I reached the top, I slammed the panel shut and bolted out of the closet. But as I closed the door, I thought I heard something, a faint, shuffling sound, like footsteps from far below. It echoed up the stairs, each step deliberate and patient, as if something were making its way up from the depths, drawn by the open door I had left behind. I ran to my room, locking the door behind me, gripping the key so tightly that it left marks on my palm. But the footsteps stopped. The house was silent, still, yet I knew I wasn't alone. And now, each night, I hear it, a soft, creeping sound, moving through the walls, shifting in the shadows. Something has been set loose in my home, something ancient and patient. And it's only a matter of time before it finds me. Days turned into nights, but sleep was a luxury I could no longer afford. Each time I closed my eyes, the faint shuffle of footsteps, sometimes close, sometimes distant, echoed through my dreams. I knew, deep down, that whatever I had disturbed wasn't going to leave. I couldn't shake the sensation that something was lurking in the walls, patient and watchful, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal itself. In my desperation, I spent hours researching local lore, old legends, anything that might explain the cryptic warnings from that paper. But all I found were vague, cautionary tales about watchers, spirits that, according to old superstitions, could be bound to places, drawn to the living, fed by secrets and fears left to fester. On the third night, the footsteps grew louder, slow and deliberate, echoing up from the basement. I locked myself in my room, clutching the key, praying that whatever was stalking the shadows would pass by. But then came the soft whispering, faint and unintelligible, as if something were speaking from just outside my door. My heart pounded, and I barely dared to breathe, listening as the whispers grew louder, wrapping around my mind in their unsettling rhythm. The silence that followed was worse. Every inch of the room felt saturated with a presence, as though I were being studied from every angle, my every fear laid bare before unseen eyes. By dawn, I knew I couldn't stay. I packed what I could carry and planned to leave, hoping that putting miles between me and the house would give me peace. But as I reached for the front door, I felt a sudden pull to look back. In the dim morning light, something in the air shifted, and I heard a faint creak behind me. The basement door, slowly swinging open on its own. Against my better judgment, I found myself drawn to it, as if the house itself demanded my presence one last time. The key felt like lead in my pocket as I approached the basement door, knowing full well that whatever lay at the bottom of those stairs would not let me leave so easily. The basement felt colder than ever, the light barely cutting through the darkness, but I made my way to the crawl space. The narrow passage was silent, but as I approached the hidden door, I saw that it was now wide open, revealing the small, dark room beyond. The shelves were empty, the dust disturbed, as though something had finally been set free. In the center of the room on the table lay a single item, the key. My key, the one I'd been carrying, was there, glinting dully in the dim light as if mocking me. I reached for it, but my hand froze as a shadow shifted in the corner, something too large to be human yet impossible to see clearly. It moved, slowly and deliberately, almost gliding, as if it were attached to the very darkness itself. A voice whispered from the depths, a low, resonant sound that made my skin crawl. It was more like a sensation than actual words, but I understood its message clearly. Asterisk, you opened the door. Now you cannot leave. Asterisk. The figure melted back into the shadows, but its presence remained, pressing against my mind, filling me with an overwhelming dread. My body moved on its own, backing away, but as I turned, I realized with chilling clarity that the house itself was no longer a safe haven. The walls, the very structure, seemed alive, as though every inch held the presence I had unleashed. I could feel it, seeping into my skin, marking me, binding me to it. I stumbled up the stairs, barely able to breathe, the air thick with the scent of decay. The house was silent, but I knew it was only a matter of time before the watchers claimed what was theirs. As I reached the front door, I felt something cold brush against my shoulder, an unseen hand guiding me back, refusing to let me go. But I ran, fighting the pull, sprinting out into the morning light and not looking back. The house loomed behind me, silent and still, yet I could feel its gaze following me, as if it were bound to me, an invisible thread linking us no matter how far I went. Days passed, but the silence followed me. At night, in the quiet of my new apartment, I still hear them. The faint footsteps, the whispers creeping through the walls, reminding me that some doors, once opened, can never be closed. And the key, the one I had left behind on that table, it found its way back to me, appearing on my nightstand without explanation. A heavy, rusted reminder that the watchers are always listening, waiting. They never truly let go. The house may be miles away, but in the darkness, I can still feel it. A hollow, watchful presence, lurking just beyond sight, waiting for the day I return to finish what I started. And when I closed my eyes, I know I'll never be truly alone again.